I'm Mitch from Beyond the Woods, and in the sixth part of the series, I'll be showing you some tones that I've dialed in to help compare Fractal Audio's Quantum firmware number 6 and the Line 6 Helix's firmware number 2.1. Let's get into it. All of the comparisons I've done so far have been kept at very basic settings to make the comparisons fair. If I went deep into tweaking into what I personally like, that isn't very helpful to you to help you hear just the inherent differences between these two units. However, today, that all changes. It's time to get subjective. I have 5 different types of tones that I've dialed in. A clean, a Dumble at the edge of breakup, a classic rock Plexi, a modern metal rhythm, and a modern lead. I'm only using stock cabinet impulses from each of these units to show you the sorts of sounds that you can get right out of the box without needing to buy or capture any additional impulses. Of course, I highly recommend that you look into importing impulses to get the most out of these units, but that is a rabbit hole of endless possibilities that I simply cannot sum up with a video like this, so I'm sticking to the stock stuff. I'm going to start by showing you the tones with the same reamped guitar performances for both units, and then I'll go in and show you how I dialed them in and why. Alright, let me run you through what I have going on here. On the clean sound, I used two very, very different types of amps, but they ended up sounding almost identical. On the Fractal, I used the Fender Princeton Reverb, which is a little 15-watt vintage combo, while on the Helix, I used the Mesa Boogie Mark IV, which is a huge 85-watt behemoth of a boutique head. So it's kind of funny that they ended up sounding very similar because they are two very different amp models. That kind of goes to show how important the cabinet impulse is, because I used two pretty similar cabinet impulses. The 2x12 Brown Super with a Bare Dynamic M160, that's a Fender 2x12 with a ribbon mic, and then on the frickin' Helix, it's the Fender Twin Reverb double C12N cab with the 121 ribbon. So again, a Fender 2x12 with a ribbon mic on it. Low and high cut are set similarly in the amp block, or in the cab block, and then in the amp block, here are my front panel settings. On the Princeton, bright switch engaged, input drive kept relatively low because the reverb, the specific Princeton model, the Rev model, relatively higher gain because it has the reverb circuit. Here are my GEQ settings. I usually don't go too crazy here, but this, for whatever reason, I felt like needed to go a bit crazy to get it shaped correctly. There are my cabinet settings, and then for the reverb on both units, I went for a basic sort of hall sound just to give it some space. On the Helix, I'm using the Amp Plus cab block here, so everything is compiled into a single block, but later on when I get into dual cab stuff, there are two separate blocks for that. There are my basic settings, 4, 3, and 4 for bass, middle, and treble. Presence pushed to relatively high. And then on the 5-band graphic EQ, I don't do the normal V-shape here. I felt like more needed to be taken out of the 240 range. So that's my sort of shaping for the 5-band. A little strange that it's on sliders that are sideways instead of straight up, just because I'm used to the appearance of a graphic EQ going straight up. But yeah. Already looked at cabinet settings. Then I did a little bit more EQ work. This is essentially the sort of graphic EQ that's built into the amp block. On the Fractal, it's a lot of the same frequencies are included here. Yeah, just some general shaping, what I think needed to be moved around. Then a hall reverb, and then this volume block at the end. There are a few patches, or most of the patches that I have going on here have volume blocks at the end. This is just for utility purposes, so my level was reaching the same point on going into my interface, because the channel volume control, I maxed that out on some of these, but it still wasn't hot enough compared to the Fractal that didn't need a level control. So that was just for utility purposes. Otherwise, pretty cut and dry. Honestly, in a blind test, I probably couldn't tell you the differences between these clean tones, so I don't really have a preference between either one. I think they both sound awesome. On to the Dumbles. This, I'm very happy that the Helix added the litigator model, even though it was kind of strange that they did not add a matching cabinet. So if you're after the classic sort of Dumble sound, if you're a purist in any sort of regard, and you're really after a totally Dumble sound, including the cab, you're going to need to find impulses to import into the Helix if you want that sort of sound. While Fractal, on the other hand, comes with a handful of Dumble cabs. They're called rumble cabs. There are 2 there, and then a few at the end there. Dumble cabs are unique because they use electro voice speakers, which isn't very commonly used. Usually you find, Celestians used by most companies, but electro voices are very, very dark, very sultry, unique sounding speakers. So and they pair very well with the Dumbles. And I really like using the ones on the Fractal. However, the 2x12 Interstate, for whatever reason, this is modeled off of 2x12 Dr. Z cab with vintage 30s in it, seems to pair very well with this Dumble, which is kind of unusual because you wouldn't expect vintage 30s to pair very well with the Dumble style amp, but for whatever reason, especially with the Royer R121, seems to get the voicing pretty darn well. So that's my tip for the litigator. Bass is completely cranked. That's not too crazy when you actually take a listen to how it sounds. I'll go ahead and show you the range of motion on that control. So yeah, yeah, the bass is completely cranked, but even though it looks weird, it sounds perfectly fine. Presence is pushed a little hot. Master's pushed a little hot, just so there's a bit of compression there. No lower high cut, pretty cut and dry as far as the cab block goes. Then some extra parametric EQ moves. I'll show you how that affects things. Just taking care of some low mids around 300 and some high mids around 3K. And then for the reverb here, I did a room reverb for both units. On the Fractal, I use the Hot Rodded Marshall mid-range, or I guess it's Hot Rubber Monkey or something. That's what they technically, or that's what Dumble calls it, but it's Hot Rodded Marshall with the mid boost engaged. There are my front panel settings, a little bit of a push on the bright control, and the bright switch is engaged because it's a relatively dark cabinet impulse, and that helps to offset it. Also a boost around 8K to offset that darkness. Again, 250, 500, 4K, those are usually my problem spots, and that's why I really like having this graphic EQ built into the amp block, is so I can quickly take care of the frequencies that I don't like. Cabinet using the 12S, EV12S with the M160, low cut around 86, and then a room reverb there. Moving on to the Plexis, I prefer using Fractal for this sort of tone much more, mainly because of the inclusion of the optional bright switch. This makes a massive, massive difference when it comes to the response of these amp models. It engages like a whole new level of pick attack, and it introduces a raspy sort of top end that just cannot be matched basically by anything I've found in the Helix. So here is the range of motion. I'm going to show you how the bright switch affects things, turn it on and off, and then I'll crank the treble knobs and crank the presence knobs just to show you that the bright switch definitely makes the most difference when it comes to these Fractal models. So as you can hear, I accidentally bumped the saturation switch there. That was totally my mistake. But as you can hear, bright switch makes a massive difference, while the treble and presence controls don't. I mean, they're definitely noticeable, but not clearly a night and day difference like the bright switch. And that's the main reason that I really enjoy Fractal, because on the Helix, there's nothing. First of all, they don't give you bright switch options, and I can't tell, like, if you listen back to them, none of the models have that inherently raspy sort of top end, so I don't think any of the bright caps on the input network are baked in. At least it doesn't sound like that. Because like cranking the presence control, I mean the presence control on the Helix, especially on this particular bright model, is a lot more powerful than the presence control that's on the Fractal. However, it's boosting a more unpleasant high frequency than the bright switch does. The bright switch kind of pulls up some really, really high highs that add to a raspy sort of character, and that's what I really identify as a Plexi sort of sound. I'm going to keep tweaking on the Helix just to show you what I mean. And this is true even when using relatively bright cabinet impulses. So I'm going to switch over to, I'll bring this back in a second, but going to switch over to simply the Interstate 212 with the Electro Voice RE20. compare back to the Fractal, which has the bright switch engaged. Of course, there are tons of factors at play. Of course, the Canon impulse you're using plays a big part, but I have a high cut here down at around 8.5K, so it's not like I have a crazy boosting of the top end, and a lot of it honestly might not be coming through well on video, but you can definitely feel it in the pick attack when you engage the bright switch on the Fractal relative to what's going on the Helix. This is all down to personal preference though. If you don't like that raspy sort of top end, then the Helix's Plexis might work perfectly fine for you, and that's totally okay. But to me, the Fractal has the sort of Plexi sound that I identify listening back to classic rock records like Who, AC/DC, all that sorts of stuff. Also, Fractal gives you many more options when it comes to their Plexi models. They include a suite of 50-watt models, which I greatly appreciate. I prefer those over 100-watt models because they're a bit squishier. Some oddballs like a 6550 power tube model, a 1970 100-watt Plexi, and then also some reissues that I really like. The 1987X is great, and the 1959 SLP. On the Helix, they just give you 3 channels off the 100-watt normal bright and jumpered, and then the P75, which is a lot fatter. Personally not my favorite, but and then JTM 45s if you count that, but JTM 45s are included in the Fractal as well. So I'd like to see the Helix step up their Plexi game, honestly. Inclusion of bright cap models, a 50-watt model would be wonderful, because I really do think, I mean, it's not like the Helix models sound bad or anything, they're just missing a few pieces and they don't sound quite there yet, and it's definitely not too late for them. I know Helix is capable of this sort of sound, so crossing my fingers, Line 6, if you're watching, come on. But all right, on to the modern metal rhythm. My intention for the metal tone was not to have them sound identical. I mean, I would have loved to if I could have, because the Fractal has a level of pick attack that just can't be matched on the Helix. I have not found anything on the Helix that has the same level of pick attack. However, with that sort of high level of pick attack and articulation, you tend to lose some fullness. So I decided to do a model on the Helix, which is the Line 6 Epic, which I felt like had a very nice broad mid-range. So it's 2 very different characters for the rhythm tone. Both were fronted with the Tube Screamer and basic boosting settings. If you listen to my effects comparison, the Tube Screamers are very similar. So drive at 0, tone at noon, level completely maxed. Same on the Helix. Line 6 Epic, it's voiced pretty well. It's not my favorite high gain amp. I prefer the Archon, but the Archon just had too many low mids for this sort of more tight sort of sound that I was going for. So I decided to go for the Epic. It's a bit too squishy in the gain response for what I personally want, but I understand for certain people that's what they're after, so I decided to demonstrate that. A little bit of a mid-range push, otherwise very cut and dry. Cabinets, went with the angles. They're currently my favorite. They have a very nice mid-range character to them. A lot of people love the tread plate, of course, or I guess it's not called tread plate here, but the Mesa Boogie 4x12 with the V30s. Just a weird high spike going on with the Cali V30, so I decided to go with the angles. M160 on one of them boosted up about 6 dB, and then my second cab is a Electro Voice RE20, dropped down a little bit just for some brightness. I really like the RE20 right now. That's definitely my favorite dynamic mic on the Helix. Then some EQ moves, and then another volume move or a volume boost at the end. So I'll go ahead and show you what's going on this rhythm sound on the Helix. Then showing you what's going on in the Fractal. I use the Splon Quick Rod. That's currently my favorite high gain amp. I feel like it has a lot of people like the Friedman Brown Eye, and I use that for the lead coming up. But I really like the Splon Quick Rod. It's a very dark amp. It's kind of a pain in the ass to work with, but it's very dark, very scooped out. So the EQ shaping is hard to work with, but the gain structure to me is just perfect. It has a really nice amount of pick attack and a very open quality to the gain structure. So I really love working with it. There are my front panel settings, a little bit of cut to the bass because I'm using a very, very dark and bassy cabinet impulse here, turning on the cut control and the bright switch. There are my graphic EQ moves. yeah, scooping out a lot of 250 here because the particular impulse that I'm using is a very, very bassy impulse, the 5153 mix. I'll go ahead and show that to you compared to some others built into the Fractal. So yeah, a lot of low end going on there. I used a very bassy cabinet impulse along with a very bassy amp model, so that was a lot to tame, but it ended up sounding pretty cool. And then I also have a separate parametric EQ block here. Usually don't have to use one of these, but I found some poking out frequencies at around 4.4 and 700, stuff that I couldn't tame with the EQ built into the amp block. So here's how that impacts things. Again, not a massive difference, and a lot of these moves I would usually make later on in the mix, just to make sure everything was fitting well in context, but I like both of these tones for what they are. I can't treat them as equals because they're just two different types of approaches, but I think they generally sum up what these two units specialize at. I think the Helix does a good job of having like a broad, cohesive mid-range that tends to lose some articulation sometimes, while the Fractal, on the other hand, has a lot of pick attack and articulation that can sometimes lose warmth. And of course, it's up to you to decide if, you know, there are other amp models that might be able to compensate for that difference, or EQ moves that you would make. That's totally up to you. But just from my personal perspective, it's not, again, as I try to repeat on many, many times, it's not a better or worse thing. It is an inherent difference. And I think these metal tones show that off better than any of the other tones that I'm showing today. And then, but personally, I do prefer the Fractal. It is the sound that I'm after. I'm after a more aggressive pick attack for the sort of modern metal tone that I'm after. Going over to the lead sound, though, this is where the coin sort of starts to flip on the Fractal, because what can be called articulation can also be referred to as harshness in certain contexts. So here I use the Friedman HB, which personally isn't my absolute favorite model for rhythm, but I do really like it for leads. However, it does tend to get harsh, as you can hear going over the first few notes of this lead here. You can hear the first couple notes squeaking. Going over to the Helix sound, obviously there's a little bit of the same squeaking going on, but it's not quite to the same degree. So I think Helix does a good job of like putting all the notes together, compressing them in a very nice way, which I think works really well for certain lead tones. Again, it depends on your context, depends on your personal taste, of course, but yeah, on the Helix, I use the Archon model, which is wonderful. I really like it for leads, and I hope they added an Archon to the Fractal. Again, the bass control is cranked, but it's not too crazy. I'll show you the range of motion on that. And one of the most important things that I can say, I think, as far as the most drastic misconceptions when it comes to amp modelers, not all knobs are built the same, especially like when we talk about the bright switch on the Fractal, like that varies dramatically between different amp models and what you're using. Like on the Plexi, it's a massive difference, but like over on something like the Quick Rod, it's only a very slight difference. So I urge you, when you sit down with any of these modelers, do not take any of the controls for granted. When you first load them up, figure out the full range of motion on each of the controls, and then try and find where that position's best. Because you can't just assume that, oh, the bass knob needs to be set at noon because it's perfect there. You never know. When you turn it down, it might boost some other frequencies or, you know, mess with the ears in a certain way. I don't know. But yeah, just figure out the full range of motion for all of these controls, and you're gonna have a much better time. On the cab for the Helix, I used angle again because that seemed to voice well, backed with the Greenback 20, which isn't usually my favorite cab on its own, but it seems to work really well for blending. And then an EQ shaping here. Taking care of 3K and 300, which seem to be the usual suspects. Just a basic delay that I threw on at the last second, and then volume to compensate. Over on the Fractal, running input drive relatively high, even though I'm using the HBE, which is a relatively high gain model. There are my front panel settings. And then on the graphic, I'm just pulling out 250 and 500, which really makes a big difference. Those are my usual hated frequencies. Using the Basket Weave TV mix, low cut at around 100, high cut at 8K, and then a basic delay. I think that just about does it. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to leave me a like or comment down below, and I'll see you next time.